In the history of human cinema, there are many films that continue to have an impact years after their release. Some films even develop their own subcultures. But if we're talking about the most influential movie in film history, then we have to mention the 1976 film directed by Martin Scorsese. Why is this movie so influential? Well, from a butterfly effect standpoint, its influence could be infinite. Among the countless people who watched this epic movie, there was a man named John Hinckley Jr. After watching this film, he was inspired by its plot and decided to attempt to assassinate the President of the United States. John Hinckley Jr. was born in 1955 in Oklahoma, into a wealthy business family. His father, John Hinckley Sr., was a World War II veteran who after the war used his sharp business skills to build an oil company, amassing a fortune and making connections with the top political and business elites in America, including being one of the financial backers of the Bush family. So, you could say that John Hinckley Jr., born into such a family, was the quintessential high-quality male. While other children were just starting their lives, he was already living in a prime school district with a head start. However, despite his privileged upbringing, Hinckley's life took a very bizarre turn. In elementary and middle school, Hinckley was a normal kid, maybe a bit introverted but otherwise fine, and he even liked sports. But by the time he reached high school, he became extremely reclusive, avoiding social interactions and becoming obsessed with literature and music. After graduating from high school, his father, with a mix of persuasion and coercion, enrolled him in college. But Hinckley was hardly interested in attending classes, and he flunked out in just a year. After dropping out, he moved to Los Angeles, dreaming of becoming a famous composer in Hollywood. Unfortunately, he had no real talent in that area. Like many aspiring artists, he believed he was a genius, but reality had other plans. His compositions were, to put it bluntly, a waste of paper. To stay in LA, he constantly lied to his family, telling them he was negotiating deals or dating starlets, all to get more money from home. He managed to keep up this charade for a year before his father, John Sr., flew to LA, exposed his lies and dragged him back home, considering his time in LA nothing but an embarrassment to the family. Back home, Hinckley spent several years as a shut-in. In the 1970s, being a recluse wasn't as easy as it is today. There was no internet, no video games to pass the time. With nothing else to do, Hinckley turned to watching movies, and he became particularly obsessed with, watching it no less than 15 times, is a masterpiece of American cinema, using groundbreaking techniques to explore the loneliness and alienation of modern urban life. The film's influence is so profound that you can even see its traces in later works like. The basic plot revolves around a lonely taxi driver with a sense of justice. After being rejected in love, he fails in an attempt to assassinate a corrupt presidential candidate, but ends up, by sheer coincidence, taking down a prostitution ring. Rather than being punished for the killings, he's hailed as a hero for rescuing a young prostitute. Hinckley, who watched the film 15 times, wasn't interested in its social commentary. Instead, he became fixated on the character of the young prostitute, played by Jodie Foster. Foster was only 14 at the time, but Hinckley believed she was his goddess, the true love he would pursue for the rest of his life. From that moment on, he was consumed by his obsession with her, watching all her films dozens of times and sinking deeper into his delusions. After several years of this, John Sr. could no longer tolerate it. It wasn't that he couldn't afford to support his son, he just couldn't bear to watch him waste away. If John Sr. had known what his son would go on to do, he might have preferred to keep him as a shut-in. John Sr. and his wife took Hinckley to see a psychiatrist, hoping to figure out what was wrong with their son. When asked, Hinckley confessed his love for Jodie Foster. The doctor didn't think much of it. After all, it's normal for young men to have crushes on celebrities. The doctor concluded that Hinckley wasn't seriously ill, just aimless and lacking purpose in life. So John Sr. sat down with his son and asked him, "What do you want to do with your life?" To his surprise, Hinckley actually had an answer. "I want to study literature at Yale." The idea of going to Yale seemed like a good one. For an average person, getting into Yale is nearly impossible. But for someone like John Sr., it was a small matter. In the fall of 1980, John Hinckley Jr. officially enrolled at Yale University. What John Sr. didn't know was that Hinckley's sudden desire to attend Yale had nothing to do with academics. It was because Jodie Foster had decided to pause her acting career and enroll at Yale. Once at Yale, Hinckley naturally became one of Foster's many admirers. However, he didn't dare approach her directly. Instead, he wrote her awkward love poems and slipped them under her door, creepy to say the least. He also tried sending flowers and calling her, but all his efforts were met with silence. For someone like Foster, this kind of behavior from fans was all too common. Rejected and dejected, Hinckley called his parents and asked to drop out of Yale and return home due to illness. But after his failed attempts to win Foster's heart, he began to reflect on himself, not his life choices, but rather what he lacked that caused Foster to reject him. What he didn't know was that the biggest obstacle was his gender. Jodie Foster is a lesbian, and she wasn't interested in men at all. But Hinckley didn't know this at the time. Instead, he concluded that the problem was his lack of fame. In his mind, to win Foster's love, he needed to be famous, but his logic was twisted. It didn't matter whether he became famous for good reasons or bad ones. Given his limited talents, he realized that his chances of achieving lasting fame were slim, but infamy? That was something within his reach. At first, he considered robbing banks, but after watching Al Pacino's 1975 film, he decided that wasn't the right path. He also thought about hijacking a plane or a ship, but those seemed a bit too ambitious. Finally, after watching one more time, Hinckley had a revelation. I'll assassinate the president. Assassinating the president would make him famous enough to get Jodie Foster's attention, and so, he set out to do just that. Initially, Hinckley targeted President Jimmy Carter, following him from state to state with a handgun. But the Secret Service's security was too tight, and Hinckley never got a chance to act. He was even arrested at one point for carrying a concealed weapon at an airport, but his father bailed him out. After being released, Hinckley returned to his aimless existence. In March 1981, his father, John Sr., finally reached his breaking point. He decided that his son needed to stop living off the family's wealth and make something of himself. He gave Hinckley some money and told him to go out into the world and prove that he could be a responsible adult. But John Sr. had no idea that his son's next move would be one of the most infamous acts in American history. Hinckley returned to New York to continue harassing Jodie Foster, but soon after, he traveled to Washington, D.C., where he checked into a hotel. On the morning of March 29, 1981, while reading the newspaper, he came across a news item that caught his attention. President Ronald Reagan would be giving a speech at the Hilton Hotel the next day. Hinckley's old plan resurfaced. Reagan had only been in office for a little over 2 months, but to Hinckley it didn't matter whether he killed Carter or Reagan. Fame was fame, and this was his chance to make a name for himself. On the morning of March 30th, 1981, Hinckley arrived at the Hilton Hotel, armed with a revolver loaded with explosive bullets. He waited for Reagan to exit the building. What happened next became one of the most famous moments in American history. Although the assassination attempt lasted only a few seconds, the series of coincidences that led to it were remarkable. Normally, the president's limousine would be parked just a few feet from the hotel's secure exit. But that day, due to the large crowd, the car was parked about 30 feet away, giving Hinckley a window of opportunity. Reagan wasn't wearing a bulletproof vest, as he thought the short walk wasn't worth the trouble. And as fate would have it, a reporter in the crowd shouted, "Mr. President!" causing Reagan to stop and turn around, giving Hinckley the perfect moment to strike. Hinckley fired 6 shots in rapid succession. The first bullet hit White House Press Secretary James Brady in the head, leaving him permanently disabled. The second struck a police officer in the neck, paralyzing him. The third missed. The fourth hit a Secret Service agent in the chest, puncturing his lung. The fifth ricocheted off the bulletproof glass of the limousine. And the sixth? It hit the limousine's armor, bounced off, and struck Reagan in the chest, puncturing his lung and stopping just an inch from his heart. If it weren't for the quick reaction of Secret Service agent Jerry Parr, who pushed Reagan into the car, the president might not have survived. Reagan was rushed to the hospital where he underwent emergency surgery. He survived, but the nation was in shock. Hinckley was immediately arrested, and his trial became a media sensation. His defense team, led by some of the best lawyers money could buy, argued that Hinckley was insane, driven to commit the crime by his obsessive love for Jodie Foster. They claimed he had no political motive and was simply mentally ill. Astonishingly, the jury agreed. On June 21, 1982, John Hinckley Jr. was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was committed to a psychiatric hospital instead of prison. The public was outraged. How could a man who had nearly killed the president and left several people permanently injured escape prison time? But the law was on Hinckley's side, and he was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a notorious psychiatric facility in Washington, D.C. Hinckley spent the next 35 years in the hospital, during which time he attempted suicide multiple times. In 2016, at the age of 61, he was finally released under strict conditions, though he remains under heavy supervision to this day. As for Jodie Foster, she has spent her entire life trying to distance herself from the man who nearly killed a president in her name. She refuses to speak about him in interviews, and any mention of his name is met with silence or a quick exit. In the end, Hinckley's obsession with Foster and his attempt to assassinate Reagan had far-reaching consequences. It led to changes in U.S. law regarding the insanity defense, and it forever altered the way the Secret Service protects the president. But perhaps the strangest legacy of this bizarre story is how it influenced Reagan himself. After surviving the assassination attempt, Reagan became convinced that he had been spared by divine intervention, that he was destined to lead America to victory in the Cold War. This belief would shape his presidency and, in many ways, the course of history. And to think, it all started with a movie. Thank you for reading. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true stories from history, updated twice a week.